Hello and welcome everyone to WTF, the Rise of the Tech Broligarchy, a bi-weekly political education series brought to you by Media Justice. My name is Maya Hayes. I'm the Senior Movement Building Director at Media Justice.
I got unmute to talk to y'all. I'm Brandon Forster, Senior Campaign Lead, also working on the movement building team here. And we're coming to you live on Zoom and streaming across social media channels.
All right, so we would love to hear who's with us and what motivated you to join us today. So please take a moment to share your name in the chat. If you're with an organization, we'd love to know that too. And any specific questions you might have. I see a question about whether or not we will be recording our session today. Absolutely, you will be able to find this on YouTube as well.
Agent.
So if you're just joining, we're just asking folks to, please share your name in the chat. What motivated you to join us today? If you're, with an organization, we'd love to have that too.
Hey,
Okay,
Gretchen,
Sam.
so great to see you here.
Awesome.
Nice to see you too, Ashley. We're actually in Tennessee ourselves today.
And please go ahead and drop any questions you also have in the chat too.
Cool. I think we can go and get started. So for those who missed our last session, we want to quickly recap what we covered. Please keep filling in the chat. It's great to see so many of you folks here, folks that are new friends and old friends.
All right. So in our last session, in our last episode, we also spoke to frontline movement leaders fighting for immigration justice. Here are some of the lessons we drew from that conversation. The first is that big tech fuels a lucrative surveillance, detention, and deportation machine. The second lesson from our discussion was that AI expedites criminalization, and its use is being expanded aggressively by the Department of Homeland Security. And the third lesson was that organizing is a must, and we will continue to fight to keep our communities safe.
And on that note, let's get in today's episode. WTF is the deal with AI? I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself.
Yeah, let's start with the latest WTF moment, which is the whiplash tariff fiasco we all went through last week.
So that turned out pretty well for the Broligarchy. For those who don't know, the S&P 500 is a stock market index tracking the stock performances of the 500 leading companies listed on stock exchanges in the United States. And what we're seeing here is that last week was its best week since 2023. This reflects on a couple of things. The first, of course, is that Trump's out of control corruption lines his and his donors' pockets. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Elizabeth Warren are calling this out for what it is: insider trading.
That's right. And the other important thing about this outcome is that the story of market concentration is also the story of the major ramp up in AI investment over the last decade.
That's right. The six biggest US companies came to account for some 30% of the value of the S&P 500 in 2024. That's almost a third of the value. That's a historical level of market concentration. And the five big tech companies, the giants we're referring to here, are Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and Apple. But the biggest winner of all was NVIDIA Core. The chip maker added 1.6 trillion in market value. That's a jaw-dropping amount of revenue growth, all riding on the success of its graphics processing units, GPUs, linked to AI computing and cryptocurrency, making it one of the world's largest companies by market capitalization.
Mm-hmm. And simultaneously, we're seeing big tech companies ramp up spending on AI infrastructure. So This year, Meta, Amazon, Alphabet, and Microsoft intend to invest as much as $320 billion as they race to build out data centers that will put them ahead of the competition. Brandon and I are actually in Memphis right now. We're here meeting with folks who are organizing against the supercomputer that Elon Musk is building out. And the movement building team will be on the road for the next few weeks. And we just continue to love to know where people are joining from. So please, we're going to have a little Zoom poll that's going to pop up shortly. We were in St. Louis last week. Now we're in Tennessee. We're going to the Bay next week. So we just love to know where folks are calling in from, because maybe there's an opportunity for us to connect in person.
That's right. Oh, we've got folks from all over,
Nice.
even folks from outside. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. A lot of West Coast representation. Thanks for joining, y'all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it looks like we're a little low on the Southwest. So if you got friends in the Southwest that are not on this call, let them know. Let them know what's going on. This is great. Well, it looks like it's settled down. Yeah, so I think we're okay to move on from the poll.
Yeah.
Awesome. So all folks can see where you all are joining from. So for those who might not know, data centers represent the core physical infrastructure for AI, like the one that they're building here in Memphis, or they've already built and are trying to expand. These data centers are hungry, soulless centers built in undisclosed locations that suck up communities' energy and resources to make computational power used for AI and cloud storage. Data centers expand the power of the tech broligarchy, while our communities end up with fewer resources, dirtier environment, and higher energy costs. Our communities are worse off while the broligarchs get paid.
Mm-hmm. And we're actually going to dive into data centers more in our next webinar, but essentially it sounds like a lot of money, as well as vital resources like water, land, energy, is going into the build out of AI.
That's right. And in the last 2 years, especially, we've seen a huge leap in private investment in generative AI.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're talking about going from 5 billion of global investments in 2021 to over $33 billion in 2024. That's a 560% increase, y'all. So big tech companies have done their best to beat out generative AI competition by absorbing it, acquiring at least 98 AI startups between 2010 and 2023. And for those who don't know, generative AI refers to creating new content like text, images, music, or videos based on existing data and user prompts.
And what could possibly go wrong with AI producing content?
Right. Yeah, just some fake headlines, lies about climate change, and pro-Trump propaganda. But don't worry, companies such as OpenAI, owned by Basic Bro, Sam Altman, are making a lot of money.
And part of how they're doing it is selling the idea of competition, particularly that the US has to compete with China to lead the AI race. Most of the investments in generative AI has happened in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and despite investing almost 20 times as much in the sector in 2024, the US only leads China by a factor of about 2 in the number of companies and organizations that have developed foundation models.
And for those who don't know, foundation models are the huge data sets, such as large language models. You may have heard of LLMs. And this rhetoric of competition with China is just an excuse for massive government handouts. For example, the $750 million that Facebook is set to harvest in our taxpayer subsidies as it builds out a data center in Utah.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into how this happened, what are the consequences, and what we can do about it. Tech companies have sold 3 key strategic narratives to the public about AI. The first is that innovation and the idea that technology is neutral and objectively makes everything better and more efficient. Two, that it will be revolutionary and provides solutions to big problems like cancer and climate change. And the third narrative that we hear often is that it can replace human labor on a massive scale.
And that last one, that threat of replacement creates legitimate anxiety. It's demoralizing. And all of this together is a flood the zone strategy. So, meanwhile, the propaganda of AI, techno solutionism, is a massive cover up used to enable the violence that AI is actually weaponized for. So, you'll see on the screen here in a moment. This is a post by Timnit Gebru, a Google whistleblower who exposed racial discrimination and environmental harm in large scale artificial intelligence systems at the company. As you can see, she says in her post, this photo you see of the Microsoft event truly sums up the state of industry, doesn't it? But Microsoft sells AI weapons to the Israeli military. 50,000 people have died. And people boo her when she's talking about genocide. And then the speaker is basically like, oh, yeah, I hear your protest, but let's get back to the important topic today of your AI companion.
And she ends her post with, I have so much respect for these protesters. Not an ounce of it for the so-called ethics, fairness, or whatever an AI people be using to whitewash genocide. We must expose what AI is being used for and how it is weaponized.
And as we said earlier, we know that facial recognition in particular is used against anyone who dissents. So the police also use it to surveil protesters. The Mother Jones article that you're seeing here and is shared in the chat details the explicit white supremacist ideologies that are central to the intention and application of Clearview AI's facial recognition software. And as folks heard from Nana Gyamfi, the executive director of Baji in the last session, almost 80% of Black migrants who are deported because of contact with the police. And we know that that contact is because of anti-Blackness and that intersection of anti-Blackness and migrant rights.
Mhm. And we also know that AI is being used to surveil and purge federal workers, as you will see on the screen really shortly. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, uses AI to monitor communications for anti-Trump sentiment.
And also, the Senate Democrats are currently opening an investigation into reports that DOGE is attempting to replace some contract workers at the Education Department with artificial intelligence. In a letter to Education Secretary Linda McMahon, Democrats wrote, given DOGE's record of prioritizing chaos over competence, there's little reason to believe that DOGE's AI chatbot would genuinely serve the needs of borrowers and families.
Right. Definitely not. And we know that AI is full of errors and is used as a weapon for corporations and the police to get away with harming our communities.
They use it for everything from automating healthcare denials to keeping our people criminalized and locked up.
The real reason so much is being invested in AI and why AI has become such a big business actually takes us back to our very first episode. In our first episode, we introduced you to the players, 14 Broligarchs, that's 14 tech billionaires who are part of the current corporate capture of the government. We shared that an oligarchy is the rule of the very few over the many, and most importantly, that oligarchies exist to preserve and expand their own wealth.
And many of these tech bros were under investigation, which is why Trump illegally fired our friend, FTC Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya, and fellow Democrat Commissioner Slaughter a few weeks ago. In January, Andrew Ferguson took over as the FTC chairman for the Trump administration. There will no longer be any strong voices at the FTC on big tech antitrust enforcement, although Alvaro and Commissioner Slaughter are challenging, so hopefully we're able to get them back. But in the meantime, uh, there's going to be an influx of lobbying to prevent any guardrails for safety and responsibility.
Mhm. So we're not looking at any future regulation to make sure AI is good for the people, but we are looking at massive investments and profits for Trump and the Broligarchy.
Right. And massive control.
So I'm so glad that Dr. Alex Hanna is joining us today so we can talk more about how we got here and how we can resist. Dr. Alex Hanna is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Dr. Hanna is the co-author of The AI Con, a book about AI and all of the hype around it. With Emily M. Bender, she also runs the Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000 series, playfully and wickedly tearing apart AI hype for a live audience online, on Twitch, and her podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Alex Hanna.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Maisha and Brandon. I'm so excited to be here with y'all, and I love to see where everybody's in for a chat. There's so many organizers here and people doing important work, so I'm really happy to be here.
And we're grateful to have you here too. I know my internet's kind of getting a little shaky, so let me know if you all are having trouble hearing me. We'll figure it out. So, wanted to start off, AI, it's really a marketing term, right? Like, what are we actually talking about here? I love the title of your book, The AI Con. Can you just talk a little bit about, why you chose that title and how we should think about AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say AI, we mean so many different things, right? I mean, so many different companies are saying we have AI in this now, and they're not really specific on what they mean. So AI can reference a lot of different things. It can reference, it's being used for things like classification. So if you are trying to, if you have a algorithm that discerns whether something is in a picture or not, if there's like a person versus a dog, or if it even detects a face in an image, that is saying that's a yes or no decision. Yes or no, this thing is in here. There's also decisions that are highly consequential, right? You brought up the United Healthcare example, determining whether people could stay on in long-term care. So that was the United Healthcare example where the algorithm failed 90% of the time, had 90% error rate, and the algorithm was being used to determine whether seniors would stay on care. And actually, United Healthcare is being sued by two now deceased plaintiffs who had been kicked off care and had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to stay in long-term extended care. And that algorithm had such detrimental decisions for those people. We can also talk about facial technologies that are like facial recognition, which I think has gotten the most kind of attention, which are those are the technologies that we've seen that have accused people like Brandon Williams in Detroit and Portia Woodruff, whether and identifying them to Black individuals who have been misidentified by facial recognition technologies. And we know from the research from doctors Timmy Jabru and Joy Bulamwini, these technologies work worse for Black people, especially Black women. We also know that these things get used in like recommending the recommender system. So recommending things in YouTube and in TikTok. I mean, if they sometimes lump and say the TikTok algorithm, the thing that represents the new thing, like the next thing, that gets called AI. And I think the thing that we are now seeing much more of is the discussion of generative AI. So that's ChatGPT, Claude, these different models that are coming from OpenAI, from XAI, Anthropic, basically all this whole body of models that generate a series of plausible sounding text or realistic looking images from a word. So this is called a sequence to sequence model. So this gets looped in all into AI, and it's actually pretty important for us to be pretty specific about what we mean, because when we say something is AI,
Mm,
it's not clear what we're referring to. So being specific, is this a large language model? Is it a chatbot? Is this an automated decision-making system? Is this a classification system? Is this a recommendation system? Making it more specific can make it more precise about how we fight back and what the stakes
mm,
are you know? And so generative AI, I think because that's gotten so much attention, it gets lumped in. And we call this the AI con for a number of different reasons. So the con, for one, is that we have this idea of AI as a vision of different things that does one thing, it generates this plausible sounding text. In this plausible sounding text, you type, write me a poem or whatever in ChatGPT and gives you this thing. There's an idea that there's like an intelligence behind it. And then that kind of idea that there's intelligence behind it basically goes and transfers to different parts of decision making, right? So if you say this thing can write like a poem or it can complete an outline or help me write an email and it seems kind of interesting and helpful, that's a fiction then that gets used to say, well, now can it like do my taxes or can it provide for city services or can it make judgments about people? And so now we get all these different claims about what this technology can do because there's a thought about what the if there's like an intelligence behind it. But AI is not intelligent. It's not even really artificial because there's a lot of people that are required to even make this stuff work. You know, there's people that have to train these and annotate the data, and there's thousands of people that are doing this on the back end, either through content moderation or data labeling. And these folks are often based in the majority world, places where whose countries are experiencing crises, and they're doing this for, you know, pennies on the dollar. And so the intelligence part of it is fake. The artificial part of it is fake. Um, you know, that's what we're that's what we're getting in. And so it's a con because it's that transfer from one kind of idea to another. It's also a con because, as y'all have really mentioned, people are getting rich off this. You know, the of half of the VC investment made in all startups in quarter 4 of 2024, half of it was going to companies that had to do with AI. So that was $27.1 billion. And recently, that's even become more. OpenAI secured a $40 billion investment round led by SoftBank, which was, and SoftBank themselves put in $30 billion. That has also been at a case where they've, SoftBank has said they're only going to do that if they drop their fake nonprofit status and go to this for-profit status to raise as much money as they can. This is also at the time when this stuff actually is not making them money. So there's $40 billion being put in this. OpenAI is only turning something like $5 to $10 billion in revenue a year because they can't actually turn on the investment. As the folks in this chat really know, this stuff causes immense harm from data centers in Memphis, where y'all are fighting right now. This computer is being built and it's putting out so much air pollution due to the diesel engines. There's a study that came out of UC Irvine that also shows the data centers that are in Northern Virginia, Data Center Alley. Those are, even if they only use some of those backup diesel generators some of the time, it would lead to hundreds of excess deaths due to air pollution and asthma. So, and that's not to mention the rising climate costs of all these things. It's estimated that basically by 2030, data centers are going to take as much energy as the entire country of India, which is the world's most populous nation. And so we're already at a place where an accelerating climate crisis, and these things are doing harm in the here and now. So the con is at multiple levels. We think there's an intelligence, there's none, but people are making huge bank off the backs of us on it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And part of what you're talking about that environmental harm is what we've been hearing about here in Memphis. You know, they talk about this is not the first time that they've been created as a sacrifice zone for industry that does not benefit the community. And so we see a similar playbook playing out. I'm really curious to hear about, I know that there are some really concerning philosophies that these tech bros have around this broader project of AI, such as like long-termism. Can you share a little bit more about the harmful and problematic philosophies that underlie this kind of AI con that we're seeing?
Yeah, totally. So there's a lot of different philosophies, and they appear on the face competing, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. So the one of them is, as you mentioned, long-termism. So this idea of bundled philosophies. So this is something Tim Nijiru and Emil Torres have called test realism, and so that stands for a bunch of words: transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, effective altruism, rationalism, and long-termism. Those are all don't worry about remembering it. Just remember it's all bullshit. It's basically the idea that first off, long-termists really believe that there's going to be some kind of a merging with computers, and we need to, well, actually, more of the transhumanists think that they want to merge with computers, and effectively there's going to be a singularity where we're like all uploaded in sort of a consciousness. And there are some people that are really hardcore believers of that, like Ray Kurzweil. He wrote a book on singularity and AI. The long-termists effectively think that there's kind of like a long-termist think that we're going to have 10 to the 47th power number of people that are going to like live amongst the stars, and that we need to be building and populating people. And so you hear the echoes of this with Elon Musk, right? We're going to colonize Mars, and colonizing Mars is going to allow us to basically, do all this stuff in the future. And basically, we need to rush towards AI, because that's going to accelerate our movement into the stars, and that's going to do whatever. And of course, that's at the expense of people living in the here and now, right? Eric Schmidt said something like this, where he said, we are fucked on climate change anyway, so let's just build AI as fast as possible, and then that's going to like solve climate change for us, which is really ridiculous. It's wishful thinking. It's the idea that like you don't care about poor and black and brown people in the here and now, and so like you're gonna build this data center in Memphis, you're gonna build this stuff in like rural Northern Virginia, you're gonna build this in like rural Ohio. That's gonna hurt people who are already suffering from a lot of healthcare issues and don't have access to healthcare. And so, but forget about them. We're going to build this, and this is going to be the thing that gets us to where we need to be. So that's one side of the coin. There's also the other side of the coin, which are people like effective accelerationists, right? And so these are people who are like Mark Andreessen, who is one of the Broligarchs, who has so much money in VC investment right now in so many of these different companies. He's also got money in Palantir. He's got money on Andrew. He's got money in these organizations where Palantir is a major figure, and that is building the database for ICE, to try to track down people to deport. They're integrating their own decision-making systems there to facilitate mass deportation. I mean, they really are the company that is trying to that Doge is working with hand in hand, and for mass deportation. And so you have Mark Andreessen, who has so much money in this, and he wrote this long fascist screed called the Techno Optimist Manifesto, effectively saying like, well, we need to rush towards this kind of idea. We don't even care about this effective altruism. They say that like effective altruism is like trying to help the most amount of people with the littlest amount of money, but it's just doing this from a complete kind of white savior kind of idea, and adopting very very terrible development economics kind of philosophies and studies to justify that. And so meanwhile, and Andreessen is effectively saying like we need to rush headlong into this. So in our book, we call these the AI doomers and the AI boosters, but they really are the same side of the same. They're two sides of the same coin, and none of them talk really about any of the harms happening in the here and now. They think about there's going to be a doomsday, or there's going to be something that we need to rush into. They don't care about what's happening. They don't care about deportation. And right now they don't care about the health of people that are the most marginalized, that are, these are, and they're working hand in glove with them. I mean, right now, Sam Altman or whoever, could say that he was, leaning Democrat or whatever in the prior election, but he gave $1 million to Trump, right? Andreessen's basically pledging fealty. Sam Altman, and this is kind of previewing the next question, but Sam Altman effectively said, like, we need AI right now to win the war against China in terms of AI. And he used this as a way to justify why we need to steal from artists to actually build AI right now. It's like, if you get rid of copyright, we're going to, or you defend copyright, we're going to lose this geopolitical conflict with China. So he's really setting himself up in this kind of geopolitical debate or geopolitical system, which is very much orienting towards this kind of notion of like American military and economic supremacy.
Thank you so much for breaking all of that down, because I think a lot of times, like we said before, we're often told that technology is neutral, and like the key players that are owning this technology, that are colluding with the government, they are operating from a particular logic. that we need to talk more about and expose that, with our communities. You touched on this a little bit before, but for a lot of people who are really concerned about AI, concerned about data centers, like we're not necessarily technologists. We don't understand exactly how all of this works. And oftentimes people are surprised to know that there are people like literally behind the scenes, like working on this. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like the hidden global workforce behind AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, just for any of this stuff to work at all, you need a lot of people behind it. I mean, OpenAI and Anthropic, they like to pretend like this stuff just works magically. Or there's a lot of people in a lab and they're collecting a bunch of data and they've sort of engineered the data in such a way that makes it so that like, well, they found some correlation between the two. But that's not the case. I mean, this is not, first off, like one of the things is you can think about AI as like a sort of magic eight ball. It's sort of it is trying to predict a set of words from another set of words. And sometimes that's not organized very well for these systems, or sometimes there's a lot of quote unquote data cleaning that happens either in the data sets themselves. There's often ways of pushing a chatbot to do things that look more according to human, what kind of like the creators want them to do. And there's also stuff that comes out that's really gross and violent that we don't need to see, right? And so one of the things that like so this whole class of workers is called data labor, and there's great work from my colleague Mila Matelli and Crystal Kaufman, where they've led a series of data worker inquiries, and I can type the link in the chat. But it's data-workers.org. And they've done a number of these data worker inquiries where people describe their working conditions in data work. This kind of hidden class of folks who are doing work, and they'll do a number of different things. So content moderation, I think, is the thing that people know the best, because content moderation had been around in Facebook and in Twitter, and every social media platform has had to have a content moderation uh, uh, team, so that they ensure that gore and violence and porn and CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, does not reach an end user. This stuff is now being scaled up to the scale of different chatbots and image generators, which, prompting them in some ways can then show these violent things. There's also people that will prompt these tools to ensure that they don't promote, violent content, or things like how to make a bomb, or how to, engage in violence into these. So there's people that have to engage that, and they have to do this across many different languages as well. And so there's an immense workforce that are doing this work, and those people get paid very poorly. They're often based in the majority world, often in Venezuela or Brazil or Kenya or India, and are making pennies on the dollar to do this work that's very violent, and they don't receive psychological support to do that. They work very exhausting days. They can't go to the bathroom. Um, they get penalized. There's bullying at work. There's a whole host of different positions like this. So this is really hidden behind the scenes, and companies really bury these people. They subcontract them the same way that clothing that's made in sweatshops is subcontracted, and there's these complex supply chains. The same thing is happening in content moderation and data work more generally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know we were earlier this year at Georgetown Law had their color surveillance conference, and we heard from folks who were data annotators who
Yeah.
realized that they were actually helping to train the kind of surveillance used to
That's right.
follow people in Palestine to blow up
Yeah.
their entire families or to try to
Geez.
identify like informal crossings at the border. And
Yeah.
so it's also like we heard there how deeply traumatic it is when folks understand like the part of the system that they're playing into.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to
Absolutely.
raise, we got a question in the Q&A. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hmm.
Sorry, my
No,
internet's
go
still a little
ahead.
messy, so if I
Go
am
ahead.
awkward, I apologize. Um, so we had a question in the Q&A that AI is impacting so many areas, including industrial ag and extractive economics, labor, data control, power. What does data governance look like? And are there points of interventions we should be organizing around?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think data governance is very important to think about, right? Because right now we have a regime where there's not really a way to control your data, right? In the US, this is pretty, pretty rough. I mean, in the US, we have the data, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act. In the US, there's no national data governance regime. There's basically it's left up to states. In the EU, this looks like the General Data Protection Regulation, where there are ways in which people can push back. There's a case in the UK where there's a worker was able to sue their company basically because of the use of worker surveillance, and they were able to take action on that, and that was a pretty big case. In the US, there's nothing like that. So the points of intervention, I think, like policy wise, very bleak in the US. Um, but there are kind of elements where we could possibly think about data governance with regards to different cities and different organizing locales. So I'd imagine, in kind of local fights, if there's a company that's saying we're going to come in and we're going to do X, Y, Z, maybe around surveillance or whatnot, well, where's the data going? Who controls that data? What's that contract? Um, you know, um, my friend Lily Rani and Khalid Alexander, they were organizing in San Diego around these smart stoplights, these smart street lights, and the smart street lights. They're pushing to cut the contracts with that organization, which was with GE, with General Electric. Turns out General Electric still had a clause in the contract with the city that said that even if you shut down the lights, they get to retain the data, right? So now GE has the data and there's no public governance on the data. So if there's points of intervention, especially with regards to things like smart cities, things like Spot Shotter, which that should be a contract that's completely shut down, but any kind of these things where there's municipal battles, I mean, where's the data going? Who's retaining the rights to it, and how can you stop that? And how can you retain control of those data?
Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat from an ally of ours from Philly Cam that's pretty like similar, but the question is, what are some practical steps that local media organizations can take to resist the extractive practices of big tech and instead foster AI applications that actually benefit local communities?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think local media organizations have a real responsibility to, I think, one, not use these technologies, right? And I think that there's a lot of pressure, especially on local media, to do more with less. One of the things that we've seen that like Google, I mean, like Google and Facebook basically killed local newspapers because of all the ad revenue that they were taking from local newspapers. And now that they've come back and they're like, okay, well, here's like a tool you could use and it can generate some news stories, automatically or something. And that's ridiculous. Google and Facebook are not going to hold local power to account, right? So, I mean, I think one of the things is to avoid any of these technologies. The second thing is wondering, well, what are you trying to do in your everyday? I mean, is it something like doing like automated speech recognition? That might be helpful for local media organizations. But I would also ask very specifically, like, what's the data? What are the data rights that you have? Can you control those data? How are you going to be sure that they're not training their models on consumer data? And there's not really any they can say that they're not doing that in the terms of service, but they might be doing it, right? So I'd be very hesitant to be using that on local media level. Um, I think local media organizations, what they can do is try to interrogate what the kind of procurement processes are in their areas, right? So like for instance, I was talking with Cynthia Conti Cook from Surveillance Resistance Lab, and one of the things that she's been spending a lot of time on is trying to understand New York City and New York City procurement and what kind of tools that they've said that they're going to use in New York City. What are the kind of other ways where if there's procurement records that can be gained on a city, municipal, and county level, and what are these tools? What are those? Who are the stakeholders there? Can you push back? I think that'd be a really important thing for local media organizations to do.
Thank you. So we had some questions, but there's also really amazing questions in the chat right now. So like
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull them up. And I'm also was curious about this too. So there's a question in the chat. Any ideas for what effective transnational campaigns could look like? We've talked about China, you talked about policies in Europe. Um, Hypothetically, with an annotators union in a global majority country and a US employee union in a major tech companies. So great
Yeah.
question, but curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I mean, there are a few organizations that are rising, so there's two organizations in Kenya. One is the Data Laborers Association, which Dare we helped support their launch a few weeks ago, and there's also the African Content Moderators Union. So, I mean, I think there's a way in which there are solidarities I think that need to be forged between those organizations and labor organizations here in the US. I mean, if you or in the global majority, or sorry, not the global majority, in the West, the global majority is not the US. And so I'm wondering if there's ways, like there may be solidarities, there might be ways to, I mean, straight up provide material support for those organizations just so they have more organizing capacity. I mean, I think there's models of that too. I mean, we have a long history of cross-national solidarity, and sometimes it's just material support. Can you provide a couple $1,000s to these organizations, right? And what else can you do? Can you support their organizing? And I mean, so I think that's one way. I mean, I think that's also important if you're able to understand who the annotators are at a US tech company. If you are at a US tech company, there are ways to talk to annotators. There are ways, and sometimes, I mean, lots of annotators are in the US. I mean, I have friends who used to do annotation work, and the way that they kind of do this is that they subcontract. So it's either like, these, Accentures or Deloittes, and they have all these consulting services. And then they actually hide them like on the campuses that are like at Google and Facebook. They might be like in a different building or something. And so I'm wondering, like, are there ways to support that organizing? Are there ways to make solidarities? Because a lot of those people are fighting things in your backyard, right? So I think those are two ways you could definitely begin.
Yeah. There's another really great question. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of the amazing questions in the chat and for engaging with us. I would like to lift up a question from Tim Carter. How do you recommend navigating the different types of AI that you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation? Which is a great question because, like, we understand the harms of AI in like the surveillance and criminalization and immigration context, but as you mentioned, it's a vague term and there's so many different
Hmm.
kinds of AI. This person said, for example, this webinar uses Zoom's auto transcripting software, which falls under AI. Is that safe? How do we parse out these applications? They're
Yeah, I
really
mean,
hard
it's
questions.
that's a really hard question. Yeah, y'all are asking very, very good. I mean, these are the most important questions, right? I mean, I think as much as you can opt out of these things, I would. I know auto transcription can be a tool that can be helpful. So I would try to, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I don't really trust Zoom. Zoom had this kind of thing where they said that they're in their terms of service that you could use they could use the user text to train their models, and then they completely backpedaled on it. And so I'd be really, careful in trying to understand these organizations, right? And I can't, I'm not gonna like, I don't have a recommendation if you should say like if you should use Otter or Dragon or whatever. But if there are, I would probably try to avoid some of the big tech ones. But, like, or if you're going to use something, maybe like, unfortunately, the way that this has gone is that all these technology companies are building very similar products, and they're just building it and making a resource that you have to rely on, right? Um, but I would say also, like if there are kind of non-big tech alternatives you can explore, especially ones that focus on privacy, that might be something that you focus more on. I I'm kind of afraid of anything that has to do with like a startup, because if the startup goes under, because most of them go under, you don't know what happens with your data. So if there are, like organizations that are more kind of collective or kind of movement minded, that might be. I mean, I think we need something like a privacy focused, automatic speech like recognition organization. I don't know if any off the top of my head, but it's a good question. I'd say in terms of just the broader question about what to engage with AI, I mean, I think you need to be very specific. Like, what is the thing that you are doing? Because most of the time, you're not going to know that there's some kind of a quote unquote decision making system that's affecting you, right? Um, Most of the time, you're walking through the street and there's a camera, and that camera might be trying to identify you, right? And you're not going to know that, right? Most of the time, you're going to be, you are in the IRS database, and the IRS database is making some classification about you, right? And so it's very hard to know how quote unquote AI tools are operating on us. But I'd say if there's any kind of cases in which there are things that get advertised as such, I would say really try to pull it back and understand, well, what is it doing? What's the input and what's the output? And what is the benefit from calling it AI? If it's saying like the input is your face and it's trying to make some determination, probably don't use that. Like if you can avoid it, right? I saw someone in the chat say, when I go through the airport, they don't take my picture. Yeah, I think that's very important. That you can opt out of that at the TSA. You can't really opt out of it at borders, or you might be able to, but I'm not aware of that. Um, yeah, and so that might be one place to consider it. But I'd say like if anything gets advertised as AI, just automatically be skeptical of it, right?
Yeah, there's another question in the chat, and it relates to a question we actually had too, because you talked about trying to avoid it, but Alicia in the chat said like it's showing up on our phones, it's showing up in our
Yeah,
email. Like, is there really a way to turn it off? And so for us, we're thinking like part of what stands out to us is that there's kind of a forced adoption of AI.
yeah,
Um, like they said, it just comes up like in a simple Google search now. But also
yeah.
like there are vacuum cleaners that can tell you when you've gotten a text message, like toasters that are telling you
Why do we
like, hey,
need
you got
that?
a you got a DM. Like, yeah. So what do you want to leave the audience with in terms of how we can kind of collectively resist this kind of force adoption on us?
Yeah.
And also, what would you like to share with the audience about kind of alternative tech futures that we might be looking towards?
Yeah, I love this question. I think we should try to resist this as much as we can. I mean, like these things are going to be on our phones, they're going to be forced. We have, and I think if we have any choice to opt out, I mean, I think you can opt out, you can say no. I don't even, click these things. Don't use Chat GPT, don't use Claude, don't use this. I mean, we didn't even talk about work and the idea how kind of these things are, my colleague Adrian Williams like to say that we're zombie trainers for these things, basically training them to do our work for us. And they're trying to use that as a justification to replace people at work. We're seeing this in the federal government with Doge. I mean, these are technologies of worker discipline. You know, they are not technologies of kind of convenience, even though they get advertised as such. So any kind of situation in which you can avoid clicking it or avoid using, I think you should. I mean, there are alternatives for Google. You could use DuckDuckGo. Um, which I use mostly for a lot of privacy issues. Um, if there's any kind of thing where something is not collecting data, I think that's, for the better. And these are not just about resisting AI. I mean, it's about resisting surveillance. In the same way you resist AIs are the same principles you try to resist surveillance, because AI cannot, quote unquote, AI can't work if you're not providing data for these tools. So, I mean, thinking about what kind of protection you can do on your phone, thinking about turning location services off, and I mean, it's really frustrating, I mean, there's kind of a different level of where you want to go with it. I know I was just sharing this in another chat, but some folks, comrades at 18 Million Rising, they did a training on travel that's actually very helpful, because a lot of those travel digital security also apply. I'll drop that in the chat. And they suggest lots of different things in terms of rights at the border, but they also do things with about protecting your accounts, things like messaging, email security, storage security, privacy-oriented browsers. I mean, these things are going to help, prevent these kinds of incursions, because, you have to remember that data is the lifeblood of AI. So if there's any kind of, if there cannot be predictions made about you, because there's not sufficient data, then, these things can't operate on you in the same kind of ways. And I know it's very hard to kind of divest from this. And I mean, it's something we struggle with at Dare. I mean, we use like G Suite and whatnot, but it's just because it's something that offers a convenience. But we really need to start pushing this, and I think that's on the individual level. I think we need to start, that's something we can do on the, or more organizational, institutional level. I mean, y'all need to keep on doing what you're doing. You're finding where the money is, right? You're finding who benefits from it. I mean, that's part of the analysis, and it's part of the work of pushing back against the tech Broligarchy, because you understand that these things are connected, that Idrisin funds, Teal funds, Alex Karp fund, supports ICE. I mean, this is very important to find the connections and understand where you're going to, put money in it and start pushing out, and understanding that, like, it's not just an element of individual action, but it's an element of collective action about what we can do together to push against this set of actors who are trying to get as rich as possible and raid as much as they can from the federal government to enrich themselves while leaving us in the dust. So, yeah.
Amazing. Dr. Alex, Hanna, thank you so, so much for sharing your wealth of expertise, for spending your time with us today. Before we let you go, is there anything that you want to share about how to support your work at DARE before we do a recap?
Yeah, I mean, you can find us at Dare. We're at Dare, DAIR-institute.org. I have a book coming out, The AI Con. If you don't want to buy it, tell your library, get it for your library. Tell your library to get it, honestly. We love libraries, and and so yeah, I mean, I would say, don't worry about giving money to Dare. Support each other, support your local movement, support your local mutual aid. I mean, I think that's where, support really needs to go and resources really need to go. We're doing okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so, so, so much. We are so grateful for your time today. Before we start recapping some of the lessons from today's conversation, we'd really love to hear your thoughts about today's webinar. So please go ahead and fill out the Zoom poll to share your feedback with us.
And we'll give it just a minute for folks to respond to the poll, and then we'll jump to our recap. Well, I guess if you all could see it, maybe I should just go ahead and read it for you. So we'll share that, but do keep responding to the poll. We really appreciate this feedback, and it helps us to get better and make sure that these kinds of political education moments can be as impactful and as effective as possible. So the lessons from today, don't believe the hype. Companies want to increase the amount of computation our society requires, regardless of whether there are consequences or corresponding social benefits. And we know that techno-solutionism is a total scam. The second point is in the hands of the ruling class, AI as a weapon for criminalization, surveillance, warfare, and genocide. The third point is that tech oligarchs are using AI to entrench their power. Big tech, through government contracts and subsidies, uses AI as an excuse to get massive government handouts of our taxpayer money. Meanwhile, they're monopolizing the infrastructure and they are exerting control through collecting and profiting off of our data.
And as we do with every episode, we want to uplift some calls to action. So first of all, keep the political education going and join us again in 2 weeks. As we've mentioned before, on April 30th, we'll be talking about data centers, the physical infrastructure behind AI. And at that time, we'll be launching a new toolkit with our partners at Kairos, for those who want to be organizing against data center expansion. Please follow DARE's work, Distributed AI Research Institute and AI Now Institute. Please share information that you've learned from tonight's webinar with your friends and family. As we've shared before, each of these episodes will be recorded and will be on our social media, YouTube, and other platforms.
Awesome. I think that wraps up our webinar for today. So like Maya just said, please join us for our next episode, WTF, the Rise of the Tech Broligarchy, where we'll dive into WTF are the data centers. We want to tell you more about what we've been learning here in Memphis and how we can all organize to stop this expansion. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
2 weeks. Bye, y'all.